done crazier things.
Okay.
Right.
Miss Polly, can you hear me?
Yes,
You don't, yes, okay, perfect. Okay, we'll get started. This is great. I'm excited about this, and it's really great to have a small group, because I kind of like it to be, if it turns into that, a conversational type thing. Feel free to interrupt me, feel free to ask questions. If I say something that doesn't make sense, you can't bother me, you can't bug me, you can't offend me. So, please stop me if something doesn't sound right. So tonight I'm here to talk about special needs trust, pretty much anything and everything special needs trust. And then at the very end, I kind of have a section on how to avoid the attorney. So how to avoid talking to people like me. Hopefully this is maybe one of the last times you'll ever have to meet an attorney. You'll have a successful life, right, if you don't have to work with an attorney. So there are things with special needs trust type things that you can do without an attorney. We'll go over that as well. So it's never too early to start planning and setting up a special needs trust. And then Sue was talking about when we were on with Paula Sands, she screwed up when she said this. She was reading it. She said, it's never too late to start. That's also true. It's never too early and it's never too late. Well, I shouldn't say it isn't never too late, because you do have to be, the eligibility rules do change when you're 65. But generally speaking, it's never too late either. This type of practice, this is a large part of my practice. Special needs trust, special needs planning, guardianship, conservatorships. I have a passion for it. My family, I should say my brother, I have a younger brother with Down syndrome. He's not that young anymore, he's 35, my younger brother, Patrick. So my family has, my parents have a very simple special needs trust. They are guardian and conservator over my brother. They are representative payee for Social Security. So, my parents have kind of dealt with these issues and things like that. So I'm happy to pass on whatever knowledge I do have. And of course, if you have knowledge, which you all probably do, that I don't have specifically, please feel free to speak up. So with that, we'll get started. Before I was an attorney, I was in the Air Force for 7 years. And in the Air Force, they teach you to tell people what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you just told them. So this is kind of a bad habit that dies hard. So basically, the agenda for this evening is I'm going to go over all of the basics on what is a special needs trust. There are different types of special needs trust, and those different types of special needs trusts have different reasons for using them, when you would use them, things like that. So we'll talk about all of that stuff, characteristics, and then the first party and the third party special needs trusts and the differences between those. Transferring assets into the trust, I'm just going to kind of show that real quick to show you the complexity of especially a first party, or what is called a self-settled special needs trust. We'll go over all of that. And then probably the most important thing about a special needs trust is choosing the trustee for that trust. The trustee, and we'll talk about this, but they're extremely important that that person has at least some kind of a knowledge, or maybe even as a corporate trustee, such as a bank, who has been trained on exactly how to administer a special needs trust to ensure that the beneficiary of that trust, who generally speaking is probably on some type of government benefit, does not lose those, does not mess up their eligibility of those government benefits. So the trustee is important. And then we'll talk about ABLE accounts. Is anybody familiar with ABLE accounts? Perfect. Sue, I'm sure is, yeah. That's great. So new information to everybody, which is awesome. ABLE accounts are fairly new. I want to say maybe 5 years, maybe a little longer than that. But they are incredible. And to be quite honest, they are designed specifically to be basically foolproof and to cut out the attorney, so that families don't have to spend a lot of money and time and energy and stress working through an estate plan, because estate plans should be drawn up or are drawn up by attorneys, and they can be stressful and expensive and things like that. So that's what we'll go over tonight. Okay, a special needs trust. It's essentially dedicated for the benefit of an individual with a disability, and they have very unique, specific language, that, and depending, what's that? Oh, yeah, no, thank you, yeah. That ensure that the trust property within that special needs trust is not quote-unquote a countable asset for government benefits. Okay, so a lot of you know, for example, the Medicaid threshold for assets that you can own on Medicaid is extremely low. It does change by state, but generally speaking, it's $2,000. You can have $2,000 in assets. Essentially, you have to be, you have to be poverty stricken, unfortunately. A special needs trust are not, if you do it right, they are not countable assets, and they can be used and money withdrawn or assets withdrawn from them to be used for specific things for that individual with a disability to ensure that they have the same creature comforts that we all have. And a person with a disability, while it's unfortunate that the federal government hasn't updated the money threshold or the asset threshold, I should say, these provide that ability if the person or their loved ones has the means to have a special needs trust or invest in an ABLE account.
Can you talk a little bit about what are some of the countable assets?
Sure, excellent question. So countable asset, generally speaking, it's basically everything, but personal property, nobody's going to come in and assess your house for, does your personal property add up to over $2,000? Personal property, once you buy it, it basically amounts to almost nothing anyway as far as the value of it. So mostly we're talking about cash and cash-like assets, stocks, mutual funds, bonds, 401ks, IRAs, all those are countable assets under the Medicaid and the SSI rules and things like that. Non-countable assets, you can own a car and you can own a residence. You can own a primary residence. You can't own vacation homes. You can't own income homes, things like that. But you can own one residence. So yes, very good question. But generally speaking, it's pretty much everything else is countable,
Including the life insurance policy.
Yes, the value, the cash out value of that life insurance policy, absolutely. If you have a life insurance policy for $1 million, that's not a $1 million value. But if the cash out value is $10,000, that absolutely counts. You're right.
And that's not even the person with special needs, that's their parents cannot have that.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yes, very good. Yes, it's wild and yeah, it really is. The threshold needs to be raised. Let's just put it that way. But it hasn't since they basically passed the 1396 rule that allows for these first party special needs trusts and the Medicaid rules back in the 90s. I think they were passed maybe the 80s, and they haven't really been updated since, or maybe they were passed in the 80s, and the last time they were updated was in the 90s, something like that. But it's been a long time.
Can you clarify once again, so what I'm saying is, not only can you not have
No, please.
not only
Absolutely.
can you not have a life insurance policy for your child that they can cash out at any time, there are the two different kinds, the one that is you cash it out at any time and get that money to help you in a situation, and there's the kind that only helps you during the death. As a parent, I had a life insurance policy for when I die to go to my child, that's a special needs child, but I was not allowed to have that because that's considered income, because they can take money out of it. So I had to switch it to a special kind where I'm never allowed to touch that. That's no money that comes to me.
Mhm.
The only thing that can happen is once I am dead.
Yeah.
Right? Can I
Yes.
explain that correctly?
Well, and that's where special needs trusts can come in too. So if you have a life insurance policy where the beneficiary of that is meant to be your child with a disability or a loved one with a disability, instead of having the child's name as the beneficiary designee, you can create a special needs trust and have that trust be the beneficiary. That should cut off that one-to-one, as in it's not a direct line to that child anymore. It goes to your trust. and we'll kind of talk about how, that's a great, we can use that as an example as kind of a through line as I talk about this, like what you can do when you fund, and we talk about funding trusts and stuff like that. So, yeah, great point, great example. And yes, we can go into that and use that as an example. Okay, two main different types of special needs trusts. One is a first-party, self-settled special needs trust. These are very specific language. Not, we'll go over kind of the steps. These are complicated, but not, in that they're almost form documents that are essentially, the language is almost required under state law. DHS will actually review your first-party self-settled special needs trust before it really needs to be put into place and funded with assets. We'll talk about this a little more, but I'll just go ahead and go into it to get away from any confusion. A first-party special needs trust, generally speaking, is for an individual who has a good amount of assets. They're not eligible for Medicaid or some other government benefit, and it's maybe you don't want to spend down. You talk about this spend down period before you go on Medicaid. You gotta spend down before you get to that $2,000. A lot of people, the advice, which is good advice, is to apply for Medicaid when you've got, more than $2,000, and Medicaid or DHS will tell you exactly how much you are over the threshold and how much you have to spend down before you can reapply. If you, get that analysis from them and they turn out that says, okay, here's all your countable assets, because they'll list them all down for you, and they say, you got to get down to this, here's what you have. You can take that excess and you can start a first-party special needs trust, should you want to. What that does is that it puts it into that trust, and they are no longer countable assets. Well, why is that? Well, the reason that they're no longer countable assets is one of the primary things of a first-party special needs trust. In fact, probably the one thing that they really look at is that the state is the primary beneficiary of that first-party special needs trust. So basically, the state, a lot of people don't realize this. I'll go into a little bit of Medicaid, and I apologize, I talk a little fast, but a lot of people don't realize that when you go on Medicaid, every dime that the state spends on your Medicaid benefits, whether it be prescriptions, whether it be a doctor's visit, surgeries, whatever, is counted. The state is keeping track of every dime that is spent on your medical needs under Medicaid. When you pass away, there is in Iowa at least, I'm trying to think of the name in Illinois, but in Iowa it's called the Estate Recovery Program. Iowa is extremely aggressive, Illinois not so much. Iowa will send you a letter, basically send the executor a letter, and say this amount is owed to, and actually the executor is required to go to the state, honestly, and check to see if there's it's not a lien, but let's call it a lien for ease of reference. Everybody knows what a lien is, so that's essentially what it is. And say if they were on Medicaid for the majority of their life, which a lot of individuals with special needs are, it could be hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical bills. They say you have to pay back. Now, it's not the family members that pay it back, it's the estate of that individual. Generally speaking, those estates don't amount to a lot unless there's a special needs trust or an ABLE account that we'll talk about later. Okay, so it's a give and take. You're not able to put it into a trust and give it to loved ones down the road. If it's the individual with the disabilities assets, you can put them into this first party special needs trust, and then when that individual passes away way down the road, it essentially will be paid to the state.
Can they pay, say that person passes away, there's money in the first party trust, they don't have a funeral plan, can they use that to pay for the funeral, any final expenses before the state comes in and pays?
It depends on the state. It's always going to depend on the state. In Iowa, unfortunately, no, Iowa's very, if you live in Iowa, you should get, now in Iowa, so we talked about countable assets. This is a big one, and I should have talked about that. In almost any state, I believe, and again, this is all state-based, and I don't want to get too legalese on everybody, but the federal statute, the Internal Revenue Code, because it's kind of based around taxes, is what dictates the ability to have like a first-party special needs trust. All of the Medicaid laws and stuff start at the federal government level, but it's funded and run at the state level. So the federal government funds the state's Medicaid program, but the state runs it. And the state has pretty wide discretion to administer their Medicaid program. I mean, they gotta stay within, some federal guidelines, but by and large, states can differ on a lot of these things. So accountable asset for most states is a prepaid, funeral trust, I guess. Sometimes they're called funeral trusts, sometimes, they're called other things. But, in I think both Iowa and Illinois, that is it's not a countable asset. So my advice is to actually go get a funeral prepaid.
I've done that.
And do it. And funeral homes, I'm not actually an expert on those. Funeral homes are actually experts because they do them all the time. So, it may be something where you talk to a funeral home and ask them about these special types of funeral arrangements where they have to meet certain guidelines to be eligible for a non-countable asset. But yes, that's my advice as far as funeral arrangements, is to take care of those long in advance, because depending on the state, you can't take them from the special needs trust. That goes to the state first. So, very good question. The second main type of special needs trust is a third party. So a third party, it does not have the rigor of required language as a first party, because a third party is, for example, one of you who may have assets that you want to benefit your child or loved one with special needs, will put it into your own trust. So it's a revocable living trust, if you've ever heard those terms. And it's you are the grantor. So the parent or the loved one, the grandparent, is the grantor. They talk to an attorney, they figure out their estate plan. There's this revocable trust, and in that revocable trust, there's a sub-trust for an individual with special needs. That you can put money into when you pass away. It can start to benefit that individual. You don't want income coming out of it. We'll talk about all this, but you don't want it, it's got to have very strict rules on what can and cannot be distributed to that individual, but things for vacations, TVs, furniture, new clothing, things like that. These assets can be used to benefit, the well-being of your loved one with special needs. The great thing about third-party trusts is that as long as they're drafted correctly, and it is extremely important, on a simple will, maybe you find something online and you print it off and you kind of fill it in, at the end of the day, probably okay. These types of trusts, not something that I would mess around with getting off online. States can get pretty aggressive if they're not drafted correctly. And if they're not drafted with the right restrictions, or if they're too broad on what it can be used on, the state will actually try to reach in and say that money is essentially a first-party special needs trust and needs to be paid back to the state. So certainly something that needs to be drafted by a professional. But the great thing about third-party is that it's essentially always your money. It's the money that you're giving to your child or loved one, even after you pass, and even after they pass. So this trust continues on. When the individual with special needs passes, you, when you drafted it, can actually name whoever you want to be the contingent or residue beneficiary, and then the money that is still sitting in that special needs trust can benefit another loved one of yours. It doesn't go to the state. So this is a great option if you have, this is exactly what I was talking about as far as the life insurance. You have a life insurance policy that you want to go to that kid, child, or someone else. Don't name that child or loved one with special needs as the beneficiary. Name your trust. Then when you pass, that life insurance is paid out to your trust, and it goes into the special needs trust, can be used during that individual's lifetime, and then it will flow down to whoever else, whether you have other children or other loved ones or whatever that you want, or charities. If you want it to go to the ARC or another charity, you can have it go to a charity. It doesn't go to the state.
And that trust needs to be This is one of the things you were saying could also be a bank or?
Yeah, yes, the trustee. So the trustee, so, yeah, it can be a human being, it can be a bank, yeah, exactly. And we'll kind of talk about how to think about and what are the important parts of, those types of trustees, or trustees for a third-party special needs.
Everybody in my family has an effect
Right.
kind of thing.
Right. So, yeah, that's exactly right. And that's why it's always good, and when you talk to an attorney, they'll walk you through it, but it's always good to name a few trustees, as inevitably people will pass, when you least expect them or don't want them to, not want, you never want anybody to pass, but when you don't expect them to.
Well, naming a bank, my biggest fear is naming a bank
Mm-hmm.
as the trustee
Mhm.
with all the fees and stuff.
Mm-hmm. Right, so
Is it
bank
gonna
isn't always
deplete?
bank is not always an option. And the reason it's not always an option, most banks have thresholds. The lowest threshold I know of, well, there's actually, I feel like, I'm not trying to, I shouldn't say it because I don't want to say wrong information, but I feel like SENB doesn't have thresholds. Most banks have thresholds, and the lowest threshold I know of, the ones that do have thresholds, is like 250,000. So the banks will not really administer a trust unless there's fees in it for them, right?
Mhm.
And the only way they do fees based on percentage of the income or the amount of in trust. And they're not gonna do a fee unless the trust has a certain amount that it sounds terrible, but it's worth it for them. So if you've got a large trust and you've got a lot of complex assets, a bank is probably the best option. We'll talk about that. But a lot of times it's not an option, and a lot of times people don't want to pay fees. And you just got to find somebody who's kind of savvy enough on the issues to do it. So. Okay, we've actually kind of already talked about this, but I'll let everybody kind of, let this kind of sink in a little more, and I'll go through this. I kind of put this in here just so everybody knows. Again, the Internal Revenue Code, it actually spells out exactly what needs to be the eligibility for a special needs trust, and then kind of the parameters on what those trusts need to look like, who benefits from them, as in the state, and then other, other things to ensure that that those are non-countable assets for those government benefits. So contains assets of an individual. This is where under the age of 65. So it is too late to do a first-party special needs trust, I will admit that. But it needs to contain assets of an individual under the age of 65 and disabled. As long as you started it under 65, you're okay. It's not like these things go away when you're 65. You just have to have it established before 65. Established for the benefit of an individual through the actions of the parent, grandparent, legal guardian, or the court. So basically what that means is that only certain individuals can actually do these trusts. And it ends up being the parent, grandparent, legal guardian, or conservator would be another word for that. Or the court on its own motion can do it if everybody's deceased and the individual needs a trust, the court can also basically order one to be opened. And then the state is the beneficiary up to the total amount paid in medical assistance to that individual during their lifetime. So those are the primary characteristics of a first-party or self-settled special needs trust. Okay, kind of gone over this too, but this is a third party, or it's basically a revocable trust or a living trust executed by somebody and who wants their property to benefit a loved one with a disability that maybe gets government assets, and they don't want this gift to them to mess up or make them ineligible for those government benefits. Few things as far as these trusts go. We kind of talked about a lot of trusts provide income to the beneficiaries. These trusts, you do not want to provide income to the beneficiary. Getting a little tax here, so I don't want to get too deep in that because now it's not what we're here for. But you don't want a huge chunk of money sitting in a special needs trust. One, the individual probably doesn't necessarily need it. They're not going to be able to get large chunks of property out of the special needs trust because it would screw up their benefits. And if you do a large special needs trust, hundreds or even tens of thousands of dollars that earn a lot of income, you can't pay that income out to that individual. And so it sits in the trust. And a lot of people don't realize that trusts, like people, have to pay income tax. Trusts pay the highest applicable rate no matter what, no matter how much is in the trust, whether it's $1 or $100 million, they pay the 40%, 39% applicable rate for income tax. So you don't want a lot of assets in your special needs trust that incur or produce a lot of income, because the way that most trusts get away from paying that income is they distribute it right away. If you distribute it right away, then you don't have to claim it as income to the trust because it's claimed by the beneficiary. But if it sits in the trust through the end of the year, it's got to be claimed. So just a little word, if you do one of these and have that issue, you should have a professional help you with that, but just so you kind of understand how that works. So no income. It shouldn't provide assets for medical needs. This is a big one, especially in Iowa. Old special needs trust language used to use a lot of fancy language about this is used for medical supplements, and you can use it for this, and you can use it for that, and you can use it for this and that, as long as it's not taking over or doing the same thing as a government benefit, okay? Essentially almost like and they used to call them, and they still do, some people, supplemental needs trust. That is no longer. The state has figured out, and in Iowa at least, the Supreme Court has gone along with it. If you do too much direction to the trustee on what they can and can't use it for, specifically on medical needs, even if it says medical needs that aren't related to Medicaid or different than Medicaid, the state has determined that that is a medical assistance trust. And when you have a medical assistance trust, the state can reach in and take that. Again, it's basically a first-party trust that we talked about, and they've argued successfully to do this. So the new way of doing these trusts in the most recent way is they are, and this is why you need a savvy trustee, they are what's called a discretionary trust, or the trustee has sole and absolute discretion to use the assets and to distribute the assets however they please. The good thing with that is that the trust doesn't say anything about medical assistance or medical needs or anything like that, so the state can't really do anything about it. And it's not illegal. It's perfect. It really is. It's perfectly legal. But we don't want the state reaching into things that they really shouldn't have. Let's be honest. So you do discretionary. That's the pro. The pro is that the state can't get to it. The con, sort of, is that the trustee has discretion, and there's not real specific guidelines to the trustee on what can and can't be used for the benefit of that individual. So they really have to know Medicaid or SSI rules to ensure that they're not providing too much income, providing too much principal, giving them something that they're using for medical purposes or to supplement or take over for their Medicaid needs or their Social Security needs. Don't want to be paying rent because Social Security handles kind of the rent. And, there's a little bit of interplay there that you can do. But again, the trustee needs to know that because the new types of trusts give them sole power to do whatever they want, basically. And then it may name any, we talked about this, it can name any contingent or residue beneficiary of the grantor, and that's the person who sets up the trust. So again, grandchildren and other children and charities as opposed to the state.
From what I understand now, you can write it into the third-party trust that money can be put into the ABLE account,
Yes,
but it has to be written in there, what I'm told.
I don't see any problem with that. The only problem, we'll talk about the ABLE account, that might come into it. Don't think there's any exceptions for like a large inheritance. ABLE accounts are essentially it's a gifting account, right? You're gifting to that individual. The threshold for that gifting is $17,000 a year. It doesn't matter how many people are giving into that. The ABLE account can only be put only 17,000 a year can be put into that ABLE account. So the answer to your question is yes, but if it's over 17,000 and it's a lot, then you're gonna break the ABLE account rules. You can only put 17, and then that excess, quite honestly, you're probably gonna need a first-party special needs trust to put that in. So I would probably, you could write a provision in there that says up to the annual amount. The other thing you could do, I guess the way I'd probably do it, is keep it in trust and give 17,000 a year. So say you've got 170,000 over the next 10 years, you can put 17,000 a year into that ABLE account on an annual basis. That's probably the
And then
best way
there's
to do
a
it.
cap to the ABLE.
Well, there's not really a cap to the ABLE per se, and we'll talk about this, but if you get to 100,000 in the ABLE account, your SSI benefits go away.
Right.
So your SSI income goes away until it goes back under 100. So, but you're still eligible for Medicaid. It's not a countable asset for Medicaid, no matter how high it gets. But yeah, there is that $100,000 threshold does start to affect your benefits, or that person's benefits, yeah. Yeah, great point. Again, maybe a little bit of redundancy here, because we've kind of covered a lot of ground on the earlier slides, but when should, this is the self-settled trust be used? When the individual has countable assets gifted or bequeathed to a current Medicaid or Social Security benefit recipient. So basically, when I run into this, and I don't do a whole lot of self-settled trust, hopefully words, getting out there, but the most common one of these is the pennies from heaven scenario. Grandma or grandpa or aunt or uncle or great aunt or great uncle that wanted to give a large chunk of assets or property to their niece that they love with special needs. And they don't really think about this kind of stuff, which, I get that. And they end up giving $50,000 to your child, say it's your child with special needs. There's nothing you can do about that. You can't take it away from the child. You can't, stop it from going to them. It's already done. What's done is done. And so the only choice you have is, and this is only if they're on benefits, by the way. I mean, I guess if they're an under 18 child and not on Medicaid yet or whatever, it's probably okay at that time. But if they're on Medicaid, on SSI, you really got to start a self-settled or a first-party special needs trust. Get that in there as quickly as possible so it doesn't affect their eligibility. And Medicaid will work with you. They know these things happen. They're not just going to come knocking on your door and say your benefits are cut off. What's that? SSI probably. SSI will stop it. The good thing with SSI is that it's easily turned back on. Whereas Medicaid, SSI suspends theirs, right, until you meet the eligibility requirements. Medicaid is really tough because, at least to the best of my knowledge, if you screw up Medicaid and they actually terminate your eligibility, you've got to reapply all over again and go through the entire process all over again. So Medicaid's the real one not to mess around with. SSI too, but that's why SSI will cut it off right away, because they know that they'll just turn it right back on once you become eligible again.
That's why when my son was going to get his life insurance policy, I called the insurance company and said, please wait till I get the trust set up.
That's right, absolutely.
Of course, now somebody else is trying to collect it, so now I have to wait, but.
Yeah, right. Okay, so if a disabled individual is attempting to become Medicaid, we talked about that. If they have assets and they don't want to spend them down, they can put them into a self-settled special needs trust. And then a disabled individual who owns a home, which is an exempted countable asset, but will be permanently moving to a nursing home, you can move that home into the self-settled. I wouldn't do that. This is an extreme example, and this is kind of the correct way of putting it. One thing to keep in mind is that when you go on Medicaid, it's going to ask you if you have a home. And then one of the other questions is, do you intend, if you don't live there right now, do you intend to go back and use that as your home? You want to answer yes. And technically speaking, you're not lying. It's everybody's goal to go back home if they can, right? We all know that that's not possible for a lot of people, and it's unlikely or almost impossible for some, but you still want to say yes, that's their primary residence, they do intend to go back there. If you do that, Medicaid will not count that asset even if the individual is seemingly permanently in a nursing home, they can basically keep that home, for their life. But, you know, if you're not going back, and if you answered that incorrectly or whatever, not incorrectly, but, if you answered that you're not going back, they're gonna count that home as a countable asset because it's not a primary residence anymore. And then you've got to make a decision. Do you want to sell it and take the proceeds into a special needs trust, put the home into a special needs trust, that kind of thing. So, when does a third party, when a grantor, somebody who wants to benefit their loved one with special needs, doesn't want to basically affect the individual with disabilities, government benefits, and then a third party wanting to gift interest in property when they're expected to become eligible in the future. So you can start that third party trust now. You know, if you have a 3-year-old child or niece or nephew with Down syndrome, that individual with Down syndrome, that is not going to be a disability that is going to, I guess, fade with time or go away, or it is going to be a disability for that individual's life. And so you pretty much know at that time that at some point in time that individual will probably be on Medicaid. And, you know, you can start as soon as that's why it's never too early to start, right? If you kind of know, you know, you can start funding those assets now, or those trusts or the ABLE accounts. Okay, this is just, I'm not going to go over this in great detail, but I did kind of want to show everybody, this is for a first-party special needs trust. This is not for a third party. But if you have to go through the process to get assets into a first-party special needs trust, it is not an easy process. And a lot of times it's an emergency type thing, and you've got to do it quick. Technically speaking, I think DHS, technically speaking, they do have forms. I think DHS does have a form. If you contact DHS directly, if this kind of thing happens, DHS may work with you directly without an attorney, because these types of things, everybody needs to be able to do them, and you shouldn't have to go through an attorney. But if you're able to get an attorney, it would help this process, because a first-party special needs trust can get complicated with all the steps you need to take. Because the first-party special needs trust, the beneficiary of which is the state is going to make dang sure that, you know, it's got all the necessary requirements in it. So because of that, you or the attorney is going to review those medical assistance and supplemental needs statutes and administrative rules, or they already know them as an attorney. They're going to contact DHS. Generally speaking, if you've got a Medicaid, if the child or individual's on Medicaid, you've already kind of got a caseworker, you'd want to work with that caseworker. If this is a new matter, they're not on Medicaid, you want to do a first party because they're going on Medicaid, you're going to contact DHS and get a caseworker on the line to help you walk through it. Generally speaking, they're going to want to see the draft of the trust, and they're going to want to approve it. And they'll redline it and send it back. I've had mine redlined by them. Every time I send it in, I feel like they find something different, which is kind of strange. And so it's probably, you know, depends on who you talk to over there, right? Like it always is. Yeah. You want to contact your county DHS just to make sure that there's no county intricacies. Usually there's not, but that's another step. The first-party special needs trust is an irrevocable trust, meaning that once you put money in there, you cannot get it back out. And because of that, it becomes its own entity, and so you've got to have an EIN. You got to go online. You got to register for an employer identification number with the IRS. You got to determine how the assets are owned to make sure that, you know, you're not putting anything in there that isn't theirs. You do not want anything going into a first-party special needs trust that shouldn't be in there. Because once it goes in there, it cannot come out. You're not going to be able to argue with the state that it's not that individual. They're going to say, nope, it was a gift to that individual, and therefore, you know, it goes towards payment of their Medicaid amounts. And then you fund it, and then you monitor it as the trustee, whoever the trustee is. So not a small process for sure. This can be done relatively quickly. Medicaid is you know, versed on it. and attorneys that, know this process, it can be done quickly if it needs to be. So a lot of steps to it, but not overly burdensome, I guess, as far as time goes. Okay, we've kind of alluded to this. A suitable trustee. Because the trust provisions are broad, it allows the trustee to do pretty much whatever they want. There will be language in there that says, trustee, you better know what you're doing, because if you screw up their eligibility, the trustee is on the hook. They have a fiduciary duty to ensure that what they're doing is in the best interest of the individual. So if they screw up, if the trustee screws up, then they're liable for whatever damages might be caused to the individual or their medical benefits. So, the trustee needs to agree to do this. You don't just want to pick somebody out of thin air. With other trusts, it's probably okay if you just name a family member that you love, that you trust, but with the special needs trust, I really would advise that if you're going to have that, you want to sit that individual down and say, listen, I've named you trustee. You don't necessarily have to know anything today, but if you ever do become trustee, please get familiarized with how these benefits work. So, again, corporate trustee recommended only if you really fit into that niche. Most of us don't, but if you do, or if the trust, if a lot of people give into the same trust, it's possible. And if you can't afford it and are willing to pay the fees, a corporate trustee is a good idea for, and when I say corporate, generally it's saving banks. They're a good idea because they're trained on it. They know what they're doing. There's almost zero chance they're gonna screw up benefits or anything like that. Number two, we talked about this, somebody knowledgeable about the government benefits. Simple as that. That's probably a number one priority. If you're not gonna do a bank trustee, just make sure that person is either knowledgeable or they have the desire to learn, for lack of a better term. It should not be the residue or contingent beneficiary. So we've talked about that. If the individual who's benefiting, the individual with a disability who's benefiting, when they pass, you've got that other individual that you want to benefit from it. I think some states actually disallow this by law, but you don't want to name that contingency beneficiary. Sadly, it happens more often than you'd think. That beneficiary, who's the beneficiary after the individual who's the primary beneficiary, they know that they're the next beneficiary, right? And people are people, and it's possible, and we all love our nieces and nephews and other loved ones, but it's possible that person starts making decisions that are not in the best interests of the primary beneficiary to save as much money in that trust because they know they're getting it. Okay, so not always the case. Generally speaking, if it's a brother or sister of that person, they're not going to mess with them. But just stay away from that contingent beneficiary who's going to benefit from those funds when the individual with a disability passes away. And then it cannot be the disabled individual. Not only because they can't handle that decision making, because some can, but the real big reason is because those can be countable assets. If you're both the beneficiary and trustee of a trust, generally speaking, the DHS is going to use them as a countable asset. They wouldn't know about it probably through the entirety of the trust, but once that person passes, they're going to dig in and see that, oh, they were trustee and beneficiary. Well, then that's countable, and it needs to all come into Medicaid to pay Medicaid. So,
Question?
yeah,
Do you find that a family member is generally the trustee?
yes, almost
They're
always.
knowledgeable enough?
Yeah,
You
so,
trust them enough?
yeah,
I don't
it's
usually
tough,
tell.
but generally speaking, yeah, I mean, most special needs trusts, the ones where banks are involved, so generally speaking, a special needs trust on its own, you really don't want $250,000 in there. That's a lot. It's going to create a lot of income, as we talked about. The ones where a bank comes in is if somebody has a large trust with a lot of assets, and under that trust is a sub-trust with a special needs with, $20,000 in it or something like that. But the bank is generally administering the rest of it. still administer that special needs trust as well. It's not like it's a separate 20,000, it's just in the grand scheme of things. But so most special needs trusts don't really fall into that. They don't qualify, quite frankly, for a bank trustee. And because of that, yes, generally speaking, it is a family member. There are other options, and it's becoming more and more common. There are these businesses now that are popping up that are essentially professional fiduciaries. They're not attorneys. They don't charge attorney rates. But essentially, they train themselves up on being a professional fiduciary. And so that's another option. I wish I have a resources page at the end of here. I didn't even think about putting, a couple of those that I know. But, if you gave me a call or shot me an email, if you're looking for somebody like that, they serve as guardian and conservator. I'm talking about that in a couple of weeks, by the way. But, they'll serve as guardian and conservator. They'll serve as trustee, as executor of an estate, that kind of thing. And their rates are generally lower than like what an attorney would charge. So that's another option for a trustee.
Is there some safeguards to make sure that that person always acts in the best interest?
Yes, well, generally speaking, yes. The safeguard is that it's against the law to do anything against the best interest of the individual. The problem is that there's no trust police out there that are watching these things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So generally speaking, sometimes they're not these issues that if a trustee is corrupt or not doing things correctly, or they're doing things for the detriment of the individual. Unless you've got another family member that's kind of keeping an eye on it, you don't find out about it until the individual passes away. And then the only recourse is to sue that individual for breach of fiduciary duty. It's unfortunate. And if it's really bad, if it's like criminal activity, you could turn that into, the police. But generally speaking, if what they're doing is just not really in the best interest of the individual, and they're not really taking care of the individual, the safeguard is to hold their feet to the fire in court, which is not good because it's expensive and it's stressful to sue people and to go through that. So, yeah, good question. But unfortunately, that's the thing with trustees. They're independent trustees, and that's why it does need to be somebody that you trust explicitly. And if you don't, then there are ways in a trust to, you can have basically a trust overseer and a trustee overseer who oversees the trustee. So the watcher watching the watcher kind of thing. That's possible. Any other questions with any of this stuff? Because we're going to move into ABLE accounts. So any questions on the special needs trust or anything like that? Okay, perfect. So as I said, I don't know if it's 5 years, maybe I'm just thinking of that. I feel like it was early on in my practice, and I've been practicing for 7 years, so almost 8. So I feel like it was 5, but it could have been 10 years ago, and I just didn't find out about it. But they're relatively new, these ABLE accounts. ABLE accounts are tax-advantaged accounts, so it's a lot like a 529. In fact, it's very similar to a 529 account, which are the education accounts. The reason that there are limits on distributions or contributions, I should say, into them is because the withdrawals are tax-free as long as they're used for a correct purpose. So, there's not a lot of tax income that the government's getting. So they don't want you they don't want you parking millions of dollars into these things. It can get to that if you do it over a number of years, but there's limitations on these. But they're great vehicles if you're in the situation where multiple people want to give. That's actually maybe one of the biggest benefits of these is that if you do a special needs trust, a third party that you do yourself, generally speaking, it would be nice if everybody in the family would put money into your trust that's going to benefit that special needs individual. The problem is that people are a little leery doing that because really they're just giving money to you to give money to the child. And it's a revocable trust that you can pull back any time. So really it's a gift to you. These are a direct gift to that individual with a disability. And anybody can give to it. You just have to give them the information on where to put the money and, you know, check, money order, whatever, into this ABLE account. So, you know, there are, I think in Iowa, it's Vanguard and maybe Fidelity. So each state has their own kind of financial institution that they work with on their ABLE accounts. And, you know, when, I have the websites to go to if you want to start an ABLE account. I'm happy to help with these, by the way. You don't have to cut out the attorney, I guess. But generally speaking, I just kind of walk people through the process. And it's more self-explanatory than you'd think. But of course, if you have issues with this, you know, please feel free to call any attorney, and they can walk you through it. But beneficiary eligibility. The eligibility requirements are a little different, not much different, but a little different than the self-settled special needs trust we talked about earlier. So keep these in mind. The disability had to have come into play before the age of 26, and then one of these following is true. They're eligible or are receiving SSI. They are, blindness is a term of art in the federal government. There's a definition for blindness under the Social Security Act. So if they are legally blind, I guess would be the correct term for it. That is an eligibility factor. And it just has to be one of these, by the way. The disability, this is the primary one that most people fall under, is that the disability has lasted or is expected to last 12 continuous months and result in death. This is the broad, and this is the very general definition of disability under the federal government kind of guidelines and laws and rules. So Medicaid eligibility, you know, this is the disabled individual definition, last 12 continuous months or result in death. You can get a disability that's provided in a diagnosis from a physician. The wording they kind of use on this is the disability has to be generally something that's similar to the one above that it's lasted or expected to last 12 months or result in death. But if it doesn't exactly fit under that and you can get a physician to write this diagnosis, you know, that is eligibility. And then there are other Social Security Administration guidelines. If you go under the Iowa ABLE website or the Illinois ABLE website, they've got a link to all of these. Generally speaking, not a whole lot of people would fall under those, but you know, it's worth a try if the individual doesn't fit on any of the other categories or eligibility requirements, I should say. I go to. Okay, who can open one? Any individual who's over 18 with a legal capacity can open their own account. So if the person qualifies as a disabled individual, but they have capacity to understand what they're doing and they have control of their own money and they're over 18, that individual can open their own ABLE account. They don't have to be walked through it. There's no reason why they can't do it themselves. An individual over the 18 who lacks legal capacity, probably the majority of people are going to fall under the last two. But the person's power of attorney, if they have one, the conservator or guardian, that person's spouse, parent, sibling, grandparent, or their rep payee, their SSI rep payee. And then if you're under 18, it must be the parent or conservator, or if there's maybe a custodian or something like that, whoever has that financial decision-making ability can open an ABLE account. Okay, so much like the first party, much like any special needs trust, these are not countable assets for government benefits, and that's not just Medicaid. We've been talking a lot about Medicaid and SSI, but we're also talking about SNAP benefits, HUD benefits, FAFSA, all those different government benefits. ABLE accounts are not going to affect those whatsoever. This is what Sue was talking about earlier, and what we were talking about is that you can have over $100,000. There's really not a limit. I shouldn't say there isn't a limit because it may depend on the state. ABLE accounts, just like special needs trusts and Medicaid and things like that, the states really govern the eligibility requirements. They're generally the same across the board, but depending on the state, there might be an upper threshold. It's probably pretty high, but the $100,000 is definitely a magic number in most states, I would think, certainly in Iowa and Illinois, whereas your SSI income is suspended until and unless it goes under that $100,000 threshold. Okay, tax advantages. We talked about this. These are tax advantaged accounts. 401ks, 529s, IRAs, same type of thing where the income it produces is non-taxable, and some of the withdrawals are non-taxable, or maybe most of the withdrawals, really. But you can only contribute up to $17,000 per year. That does adjust annually. Like a few years ago, it was 15. I think it ticks up with again, we won't get too much into estate taxes, but there's a gift tax threshold of $17,000 a year that years ago was 13, and then it was 15, and now it's 17. It probably tracks with that, at least mostly. So it's the same as the gift threshold where you don't have to file a gift tax return with the federal government. This kind of follows along with that. The first 3,785, I'm not exactly sure where they got that number. And this is Iowa's, and I'm kind of giving this as an example. This is from the Iowa Able website. I didn't double check Illinois, and I should have, but I do have the website up here for the link to it. Illinois is almost certainly the same, but it could be a little different. But basically, up to 3,785 per person is tax deductible. So basically, it's basically a charitable gift is what it amounts to. It's deductible just like if you gave money to the arts. So that's a great benefit for contributors that they can give up to that amount. This example here that Iowa has on their website, so what they're showing is that $17,000 a year, only, no matter how many contributors you have, only $17,000 can go into that ABLE account every year. So the example they show here is the account owner or the individual with a disability contributes $2,000, they get a $2,000 tax deduction. A friend contributes $1,500, they get all $1,500 as a tax deduction. Grandma gives $3,785, the entire amount is a tax deduction, and then mom gives $9,715, and she can deduct $3,785. Okay, and all that adds up to $1,700 or $17,000. Excuse me. Okay, tax advantages for beneficiaries. You can withdraw, or the individual can withdraw, the account owner, I should say. Those withdrawals are tax-free for qualified expenses. This is extremely broad definition of qualified. So education, health and wellness, housing, transportation, employment training, and then both websites, Iowa and Illinois, both say basically anything considered a basic living expense is a qualified withdrawal. They don't talk about vacation funds, but if the individual is going on vacation and they need money for food or housing or, lodging, I should say, that's a basic need, right? So it's a basic living expense, so that counts. So pretty much everything under the sun, it's not gonna, things that wouldn't count, the only thing I can, top of my head is like, probably not gonna give them money to go to the casino or something like that. Like something that would probably not be what considered a basic living expense, but I don't know, maybe it is. I mean, it is, I guess it's fun, it is entertainment, so maybe that would work. Maybe that's a bad example. Generally speaking, they can withdraw as long as it's for their benefit. Let's put it that way. Okay, I've got some websites up here. And, if anybody, I have my email and phone number. If anybody wants me to send, like I can make these slides into like a PDF and shoot them off to you in an email. If you wanted to email me, I'm happy to send them to you. Or you can write these down either way, but I'll kind of leave this up here. So the Iowa ABLE website and the Illinois ABLE website, they are great websites. They really do try to walk you through it, and then they provide phone numbers to call, those kind of things. And so there's tons of resources on these websites to walk you through it. The true purpose of these really is to cut out the middleman, to cut out the attorney, to give you an option to, provide a very simple investment vehicle, for anybody to give to your special needs loved one, for them to benefit from without going through the stress, time, money of setting up a special needs trust. So, I will talk these up every day of the week. They're really great. They don't work for everything. It's not gonna work if they get a large windfall from family. And that's an important discussion to have with your family. If you have parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles that you know love, which I'm sure all of them do, love your loved one with a disability, and you even have an inkling that they might give them a windfall and don't know about all this kind of stuff we talked about tonight, it's really important to have that conversation. If you have an ABLE account, hey, if you want to give to Tim or Susie, you know, here's where you can do that. Or you can do your own special needs trust, you know, that kind of thing. So, it is important to have those conversations, but these are great vehicles to do that. Any questions? That's all I have on ABLE account. Any questions on ABLE account?
I guess one thing I want to make sure, I don't know if I heard this correctly. Are some of these accounts governed by the government where you're only allowed to spend them on things that they, did I just miss that?
You missed that slide.
Oh, yeah. No, well, I'll go right up to you so you can see it.
Social Security is so hardcore.
Right,
It has
so-
to be medical, it has to be.
So it's not as hardcore as that. So they have a different, so they're called, under the law that runs these ABLE accounts or that governs them, it's called a qualified expense. Everything listed here, there's a long list on each website, by the way, too, but then it also says on the website, it goes into it and says, anything considered a basic living expense is under that. So they're very broad. They're not as restrictive as like Medicaid or, you know, Medicaid is somewhat broad too. You can use like your special needs trust, as long as you're not blowing the assets, limit. You know, generally speaking, you can use a special needs trust assets on most anything. They just can't accumulate assets from it. Same kind of thing here. You know, we were talking about, vacations, you know, there's no reason why if the individual is going on a vacation and are paying their own way, they're going with friends maybe, I mean, they need food on vacation, they need lodging on vacation, those are basic living expenses. So there's no reason why you can't spend the ABLE account on things like that too, as well as education, health, housing, transportation, yeah.
Do they have to keep a list of the expenses? I mean, does anybody check that?
Yes, so, yes, 100%. So a lot like, you withdraw from an HSA. If you have an HSA and you withdraw from that, those withdrawals are exempt from taxes too, as long as they're qualified medical expenses, right? So same kind of theory here is that you do need to keep track of them. And when you file, I don't know what form it is, but you probably have to file, or with your taxes, you have to file some kind of a schedule, whatever, and declare what was withdrawn. And yeah, they need to make sure that they're qualified expenses.
It can be rejected.
Yeah, I think they could. You know, I'm not 100% sure how common that would be. If it's egregious, yeah, they're gonna catch them, but, they really, I think they purposely made it broad, because they really don't, I don't think the IRS wants to micromanage what people are withdrawing from their, ABLE account from, you know? I just don't think that they really want to micromanage that. So they've kind of made it broad on purpose. But yeah, you don't want to be egregious with it. And I'm trying to think of a really good example that would be. Yeah, sure.
Share. So where this is coming from is, my son was 42 pounds, he was 43 specialty doctor to this day,
Mm-hmm.
yada, yada. Lifelong horror. So, had Social Security for 2 seconds when he was school for like 6 months, applied for years, and then finally got it. And the judge said, you know, if you lived in Iowa, I would be able to give you his lifelong. You deserve his lifelong, but I cannot do that. I can only do it from when we started. So we started 4 years ago. So, that 4 years worth of the collected Social Security that he was owed, which I am monthly allowed to spend on taking him to a movie, getting him a pizza, buying him a toy,
Right.
anything. They said, you were only allowed to use this 4 years worth for medical, educational,
Right,
something.
right.
Then they audited us, and I had done everything right, and I was drowning in this pile of paperwork, so my mom went out and bought the, what's that machine?
Calculator.
No, the one that prints it all out, like,
Anyway.
so
Yep.
we sent in every penny that was spent, everything that it was spent on. It was all things that were needed, like there was a fire in our apartment building, we had to move, we paid movers. They said, you owe us $40,000 now, we don't believe that those are fitting.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why we're nervous about these things.
Yeah,
But then when I
that
went
would
to
make
a
me
lawyer,
nervous too.
The lawyer said, you spent it all on everything that you needed for your child,
Right,
and I don't even own a car, I don't own a home, I
Yeah.
don't have anything. They're like, I wouldn't even worry about it because they can't squeeze blood from a turnip at this point.
well,
But
that's true.
that's just the things that I worry about, these
Yes.
things that are given to you, and even when you go about the right way. And we sat for months and gave every penny and 14 pamphlets full and this all, nope, you owe us 40,000. I'm like, I don't have $1, I owe you 40,000.
Yeah, I think the auditing is scary with all of that because, I mean, even for example, my brother,
Okay.
I'm sure if his expenditures and income and stuff were actually audited, yeah, it probably wouldn't be good. I think that's most people. When you're on it for a long time, there's just generally speaking, there's gonna be either mistakes made or oversights or whatever. Yeah, I mean, what I would say, especially about the ABLE,
Okay.
is that it is definitely not, and I would advise you to go on the website and really read it. It is not, it's not tied to the same statute that the SSI benefits are under. SSI is, I do know, like, SSI is very particular about, I think the actual restrictions are a lot, even more so than Medicaid.
Absolutely.
So SSI is kind of its own special creature, probably because it's monthly and it's just it's a lot.
Right.
And SSI benefits are not, you don't pay them back, right? So that's probably why they're more hawkish on that. Whereas the Medicaid stuff, like the state's not gonna watch that like a hawk because they know the individual doesn't have a whole lot of assets anyway, and they know that if they do have a lot of assets that are hidden, they're gonna get them upon death. And they're gonna find them and they're gonna get them. And that's why they have a whole office called the Estate Recovery Program to do that. Whereas SSI, once they dish that money out monthly for income, it's gone, and the only way they can get it back is exactly what they did to you, which is terrible.
But that wasn't
But-
even like the monthly, like, yeah, monthly, we were allowed to spend.
Oh, this was the
This
four,
was,
oh,
this was the 40,000
Right.
lump sum for
right,
4
right,
years.
right.
Which my mom always said, it's so strange because you're allowed to spend that monthly on a toy for him,
Right.
on a pair of socks for him.
Yeah,
But heaven forbid
that lump sum, yeah. Well, yeah, and I do understand your
warn
hesitancy.
everyone.
I don't blame you, and I probably would honestly continue to operate conservatively like you probably are. But from my perspective, and my advice is that the withdrawals on these ABLE accounts are pretty broad-based. But yeah, it is safer to be conservative, I would say that,
And keep
so.
every receipt of everything, you guys.
Yeah, that's
Like,
100%.
Don't keep the receipt, make a copy of that receipt,
There you go.
paid.
There you go.
Yeah, that's-
And,
That's true.
and
That's
keep a
true,
file.
too. Yep, yep.
100%. And these websites, the websites do have advice on keeping track of the withdrawals and making sure that you're keeping good records and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, good.
And like, we were never allowed to use, without having a car, was that in my situation, a lot of times I just needed cash on hand, so I would just withdraw from an ATM from that.
Right.
And they really didn't like that, and I was like, I don't know what to do, like, the people came to drop off my washer that I bought for my child that wets the bed still at 15, and I had to pay them something when they came, and
Yep.
so just, everybody be careful.
Yeah, very good advice. Very good advice. Well, I talked a little fast, Sue, I'm about 15 minutes early, but,
I'll forgive
so
you.
we have 15 minutes for questions, if anybody has them. My email and phone number, that is the direct line to my desk, and it doesn't get filtered through my assistant. You'll either get me or my voicemail. I'm happy to take calls or questions or whatever. I'm not here to hawk my card, but I do have a card if you do want it, but I'm not here for that, but if you do want one, I did bring a few. But yeah, I'll hang out for questions as long as anybody's here and wants and ask questions, so.
We appreciate so much.
Oh, I am very, very, very happy to do it.
Sharing this with them is so huge. My child is now 15, and I keep hearing, I need to do these things in a couple weeks, so when you're presenting, so grateful for you, because I had no idea what that meant, and thank you.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks for coming.
Lois, do you have any questions?
Yeah, I can't see the, address very well. Could you read the email address to me?
Sure, Lois, yeah, it's, T as in tango, G as in golf, U as in uniform, L as in Lima, B as in Bravo, R, A, N as in November, and then SON, like sun, at L hyphen W, and then LAW, so L hyphen W law.com.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
And Lois, this will all be put up on our website, so if there's anything that you've missed or you wanna go back and look at, eventually Sarah will get it put into the website.
Oh, perfect. Wonderful.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Look, I had a bunch, now I can't remember what I had.
Never fails. Never fails.
So to elaborate a little more, so prepaying on the funeral is a smart thing. With my child, I know he is not living a long, expensive life kind of thing. So that's something that we could do and then not have to worry about the government coming after any of the money in the ABLE or in any of those.
Yeah, those funeral trusts, I wouldn't consider myself an expert on those. I know just enough to be dangerous. They have restrictions. They have, it can only be so much, you're not gonna have a $50,000 funeral, that kind of thing.
Right.
You can't park a bunch of money into it. But, yeah, there's definitely enough that you can have a nice, reasonable, funeral that most people would benefit from. But yeah, generally, from what I know is that most funeral homes are very well versed in it. And can walk
Awesome.
people.
Like you said, we
I
can
think
talk.
they have to be irrevocable, like, they
Yes, they
can't
do,
go back
100%.
and
That's
say,
one of the
well,
restrictions.
we
Yeah.
want the money back, we don't want.
That's right.
Okay, makes sense.
That's exactly it.
Oh, I guess I didn't know the part about that the medical stuff is owed back.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I'm like, oh my
Most people
gosh.
don't. Oh, yeah.
So what happens to someone like me that has nothing and has had my child in and out of the hospital every other
Nothing.
day his whole life?
Nothing. It's only on the individual who's disabled. So if the individual who's disabled, generally speaking, they don't recover a whole lot, to be quite honest, because generally speaking, that individual, to their name, almost always has nothing. The only time that estate recovery in Iowa ever gets anything back is if there's an ABLE account, a trust account, something like that is benefiting that child. So no, the parents, the grandparents, anybody else, with, no, they're not gonna come after you personally, no. Definitely not.
Like, I think we called my son the $1 million man. He was in the NICU for 100 days, just his first 100 days, I think, was $1 million already, kind of thing, like. So I was like, oh my goodness, I'd be selling the clothes off my back, like, I don't want to. Okay.
we were there for 2 weeks with my youngest. I can't imagine doing 100 days. That's,
10 days, that was enough.
yeah.
People are special that work in those places.
Yeah, they are.
Miracle workers, for sure.
I have guardianship of my sister. And back to that point, we lost our mom last year, and the estate's still in probate.
Okay,
And it's all, the will was written for it to come to me.
okay.
Like you said, it's still in probate with a lawyer in downtown Rock Island.
Mhm.
I'm worried about what to do, because there are some retirement investments and that type of thing, and I don't want it to go to her. I don't want her to lose, but like you said, they can't come after the estate to pay that per Medicaid, because it's not
No.
willed to her.
Your mother's estate?
Yeah.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
What they can do, so your sister's on Medicaid now? Okay, and is she a beneficiary under anything? Okay, then no, there's none of it
And
can,
some legalese, when the lawyer filed with Rock Island County Probate Court, her name was mentioned, but in the original will, no.
yeah, oh, yeah, no, you've gotta do like an heirship, affidavit of
She was
heirship.
declared in 1998 legally disabled.
Yeah,
So,
no, there should not be
I sit there and
any
worry about that.
recovery.
Are they gonna,
Yeah.
like, my sister's gonna lose everything that the ARC's provided for her, and, right?
No, definitely not.
There's always something to worry about.
I know, right? There always is.
That is true.
Anybody else?
Is this what got you into this field, with you having is it a brother you said? that-
Yes, one of my younger brothers,
Okay.
yeah, is an individual with Down syndrome, and, yeah, I mean, to a certain extent. And so when I was in law school, I took estate planning classes and liked it, and then when I became an attorney, I just kind of gravitated to it, just naturally, and, yeah, and, you know, I'm on, I'm not on the board, I'm in the gala committee, but I was on the board at Gigi's Playhouse, for years, and I was the president of the board there and still involved, and then I'm on the board at Riverbend Transit over in Davenport, and, you know, so it's just something that, hand in hand, I'm on the board at hand in hand.
We need to bring them on our board.
Yes, you do.
So it's just a passion of mine, it's something that, yeah, I gravitated toward naturally.
Awesome. Brother's lucky to have you in his corner.
We're lucky to have him, he's, yeah, if you know anybody with Down syndrome, they are pretty incredible
Special.
people.
Very.
So what happens if you don't have any of this or disabled?
Uh-huh. What,
What do you mean?
oh, if you don't have anything?
Right, no trust,
We don't have anything
no
set up
gifting,
yet.
right.
Yeah, you know, it's okay. I mean, at the end of the day, they don't have to have the trust, you know. I can use my brother as an example. My parents technically have a trust, but my parents don't have a lot. So there's not a trust that's like funding him. He's lucky he's able to work. So he's worked at McDonald's for 18 years, and so he lives off his income and things like that. Of course, he's still, he's gotta be under that threshold. In Iowa, they've raised it to 10,000. So at least that's fortunate. So he
They're
can
allowed
a
to
little more.
have,
Yeah, so he's allowed to have a little more.
instead of the 2,000.
Instead of the 2,000.
Wonderful.
Correct. So, you know, if they just don't have one, you know, at the end of the day, the hope is that there's somebody that can, you know, financially, but the threshold is just so low that, you know, they basically have to end up, if they can't work, and there isn't a trust for their benefit or an able account for their benefit, you know, they live off their SSI income and rent payments or rent assistance, and their medical is paid for. So the basic necessities of, you know, a little bit of monthly income and all of your medical issues kind of handled are taken care of. But yeah, you know, it's nice to have those creature comforts that all of us, the rest of us, are able to have, and that's what the able accounts and the trust are able to do. But, you know, technically speaking, I guess the Social Security and the Medicaid provide those basic needs. Supposed to.
Right.
Yeah,
And if
do
you're
they?
in a group home after things are paid for, there's only $60 a month left, and that's to pay for any of the extras. I mean,
Yeah.
if you need more clothes, you know, whatever you need, any entertainment, just not a lot.
No, it's not.
Hygiene products, I started a free hygiene closet here just to try to help alleviate some of those expenses. There's just not a lot left.
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you, because at the end of the day, it's unfortunate that the restrictive thresholds they're just too low.
Do you foresee things like how Illinois or how Iowa is now letting people have $10,000? Do you foresee Illinois letting that go up or things go up?
I hope so. I just, I don't.
Who knows? Who
I don't
knows,
know.
right?
The pace of government on any level of government is a snail's pace, so.
True.
And a lot of times, government doesn't do anything unless there's some kind of catalyst or emergency that requires them to do it. So if there isn't that, then maybe not. It's probably not at the top of the priority list, which is really unfortunate, so.
Okay, so the next week that you're doing this, it's a couple weeks
The
away,
25th,
right?
Yep.
That's gonna be more about, explain that a little.
Yes. Yeah, so I'll be talking about guardianships and conservatorships.
Awesome.
You're well versed on it apparently, you're served as a guardian, so.
I was granted guardianship in January. I need to go online and take our
Oh, yeah.
guardianship course.
Yep, within a year, you gotta do it within a year, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll be talking about that and what, same type of thing as when is one necessary, when is one maybe not necessary, and you can get away with not having one. But, yeah, I mean, I'm happy to answer a few questions about that, but yeah, we're
Yes,
talking
with
about.
my child being 15 and everybody says I probably need to get that done before he's 18.
Well, are you an Illinois resident or Iowa?
Illinois.
Yeah, so I get these phone calls all the time.
Okay.
Schools keep telling people that you gotta do this before they're 18 and blah, blah, blah. So in Iowa, the laws allow you to actually get a standby guardian assigned 6 months prior to the individual turning 18. In Illinois, the courts will not, they say they don't have jurisdiction until that individual is 18.
Actually 18.
You have to be 18 years old. And so what we try to do in Illinois, what I try to do with my clients that need a guardianship when they're, as soon as possible, when they're 18 is, I'd say 4 to 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks before, we can start getting the documents ready and stuff. But you can't, I mean, you can file them before they're 18, but then what I try to do is I set the hearing for appointment of the guardian on the 18th birthday. So there's as little a gap as possible. Sometimes it doesn't work out. I just had one where I had to do it the day after because the judge wasn't in town.
Things like that.
Judge Thompson here is the only one who will do, so that was probably Judge Thompson who,
You know?
yeah,
Yeah.
yes, when
Very nice.
Very nice, yeah,
Calm.
very, very nice,
Yeah,
yes.
we did it on a speakerphone at the lawyer's office.
Oh, sure.
So it wasn't like I had to go in the courthouse and be all nervous.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's good.
And once she started talking, it was anything.
Yeah, she's great, and she's very, very, very knowledgeable, and she does all of them in Rock Island, so.
Wonderful.
So all the attorneys that go in front of her know her really well, and know how she works and that kind of thing. So anyway, that's how Illinois works, is that you don't need to start it now, he's 15, literally you've got a few years before you contact an attorney, because they're not gonna be able to do anything until they're 18.
And you do Illinois as well?
Yes, I'm licensed in Illinois, so Iowa.
Okay.
And in Illinois, they're actually called guardian, I keep saying guardian conservator. That's
Guardian
Iowa's
ad
term.
litem.
Illinois is guardian of the person and guardian of the estate.
Oh, okay.
Okay. The state is the financial and the person is medical decision. I assume your sister probably is a rep payee.
Here's our.
Oh, yeah, great, perfect. So we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. So a conservator or a guardian of the estate, generally speaking, those reporting requirements are more difficult, and it's more difficult to keep track of the finances down to a T, a lot of times. So if you have a rep payee, you probably don't need a guardian of the estate. That's great. The ARC provides rep payee services. That's awesome.
Yeah, what?
We're
So
like, what's a red
conservator or
pea?
a financial kind of steward of an individual, generally speaking, and I'll talk about this in a couple of weeks, but there are exceptions to this, but generally speaking, if an individual is on Social Security and has a Social Security rep payee or representative payee.
Like
generally
me, being the
speaking,
mom?
yeah,
Like
being
how
the mom.
I'm a pay,
Yeah,
okay.
you
Okay.
still need that guardianship, but you shouldn't generally need the conservatorship to go along with it. Which saves a huge hassle with the court and the reporting requirements and things like that.
Okay.
The conservatorship reporting requirements are much more stringent than the guardianship.
Anybody have anything else?
Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, guys.
And again, we'll be back in 2 weeks
2 weeks.
for the guardianship and conservatorship.
Here.
I would like one of your cards if you have it.
Sure.
I
absolutely.
would too. Yeah, let's take